Okay, so just like in our other promise, we actually want to resolve the value. And actually I'm seeing that this is not quite correct because we're still missing our set timeout here, of course. So let's add that very quickly. So set timeout. Then in here we want to pass in an ID. And then this code, of course. Then 1500 seconds. And then we pass in rec ID. So does that make sense? So into this getRecipe function, we pass in rec ID, so the recipe ID, which we then pass into this set timeout. And so then it will become ID. And then inside the callback function, we use ID here. So this needs to be ID in uppercase. Okay, now how do we actually consume this promise here? So let me show it to you. So what we could do here, of course, is to simply call the getRecipe function here and then add a then to it. So just like this, like getRecipe with IDs 2, just like we did before, and then this would return a promise, right? And then we could add the then, and so on and so forth. But this would not really solve the problem of the callback kill, right? Because then again, we would have this callback here, this then inside of another then. And that's not ideal at all. And so there's another way of doing this. And that's actually the beauty of promises, which is something called chaining. So we can return a promise from this then method here, and then simply add the next then method after it. So let me show that to you so that it makes more sense. So I do it like this. Return getRecipe IDs 2, and then I can add the next then after this. This getRecipe here will return a promise, okay? So after this here runs, we will have a promise here. And what we do then is to return that promise. And therefore we can then add the next then to handle the result of that resolved promise. Okay, so we now have this promise here and now want to handle the fulfillment of this new promise, okay? And what will happen when this promise is fulfilled is that it will basically return this data here, okay? And that is our recipe. So let's call this parameter of this callback function here the recipe. And then simply log it to the console. And let's try it out here. So the IDs, and then finally the recipe. So it's working just fine without any of the callback hell that we had up here, right? So now our code is all nicely separated here into these different functions. And then down here we consume these promises. We could of course put this one here into a function as well, but that's not really necessary because we don't need to pass any data into this. So here this getRecipe, we did it as a function because we needed to pass in this recipe ID into this promise here, okay? And so that's the second one. And now finally let's work on the last one. So let's add another function here called getRelated. And remember that this one here is basically to fetch a recipe which is related to the author of the first recipe. And so of course this needs to happen in a sequence because we can only load a related recipe if we already know the publisher that we're looking for. And so we need to do this in these 3 steps just like we did before. So again, return a new promise. Then resolve and reject. And again, this is always like the same here. And oh, I forgot to put the parentheses here for the arrow function. And then again here, the set timeout. Let's just say pub here. After 1.5 seconds, so 1500 milliseconds, and then the publisher. So just the same logic as before. So this publisher is the one that we get here as an input to this function, which will then be passed into the callback function of the set timeout and will then be called pub. Okay, and now I'm just going to copy the code that we have up here again and simply paste it here. And again, we don't want to log it to the console, but we want to resolve this promise and return this recipe here. So recipe, and let's call it recipe here as well. And let's actually also use this pub argument. I think up there we didn't actually use it, but let's do that down here. So let's use a template literal here again. And say pub, and then show the recipe here. So the Italian pizza. Okay, and so that should get the job done. And so now, in order to consume this promise, I'm going to do it in the exact same way as before. So we receive our recipe here, and now I will return the result of calling getRelated. So getRelated, and what we passed in here then is the recipe.publisher, right? So recipe.publisher, because that's in this case here Jonas, right? So we get Jonas from our recipe and then pass it into the getRelated function. And so all of this here will return a new promise. And so just like before, we can then use the then method on it. And again, we receive a recipe, and so I can call it recipe again because it's a different function than this one here, and so I can simply reuse this name. And so now let's again log this recipe to the console. Give it a save, and let's try it out. So after 1.5 seconds this one, then the first recipe, and then the related recipe. And now we get an error here saying undefined and then this weird object. And I think I know why this is happening. And that's because our recipe here actually returns a string. Okay, so you see here that we actually resolve this entire string here and not just the recipe object. And so therefore we can then not read a recipe.publisher. Okay, and so instead I'm simply going to add Jonas here. Okay, so in this case, it doesn't really matter. And so that solves this first part here. Then after that, I have object. And that's because here I put this entire object here into a string. But instead, I just want recipe.title, just like we have here in this line of code as well. Okay, and if I do this now, then it should work. And now, finally, yeah. So Jonas, Italian pizza. I could of course pass something else here, just like my entire name. And so 1.5 and 1.5 and finally another 1.5 later, we get this entire result. Okay, so that is how we do the same thing that we did before with the callback hell with promises. So instead of having this really messy and unmanageable code, which is actually a lot less code here, but it still is really unmanageable, especially if we had more code and deeper nested callbacks, then it would become really like a nightmare to maintain. And instead, we have very nicely separated code here like this, where we produced all of our promises, and then in the end, we simply consumed them here with this chain of thens, and finally then a catch to catch if there's any error. And that's it about promises. Pooh, this was a lot to take in. And I find promises to be one of the hardest, if not the hardest concept to grasp in JavaScript. And so please don't worry if you didn't really understand it 100% on this point, okay? Because what really matters is actually how we consume promises and not so much how we produce. Because that is oftentimes already included in some kind of libraries that we're going to use later in the course. So we learned how to construct and how to consume promises, but the syntax to consume promises can still be quite confusing and difficult to manage. And so in ES8 or ES 2017, something called async await was introduced to the JavaScript language in order to make it a lot easier for us developers to consume promises. So let's now take a look at async await. So again, async await was designed for us to consume promises and not to produce them. So if we want to produce promises, we just do it the way that we learned in the last lecture. But most of the time, we're going to consume promises anyway, and async await makes that a lot easier to do. So without further ado, let's see how to use it in practice. And what we're going to do is basically to change the way we consume them in the last lecture, so this piece of code, and instead use async await. So these promises that we have here, these three, we will continue using them. We will simply get rid of this code here for now and do the same thing with async await. Okay? And so we start by creating an async function. So use the async keyword, then function, and let's say get recipes, and then I'm going to call it AW for async await. Okay, and then we can also just call it down here. All right. So this is a new special kind of function, which simply means that this function is an asynchronous function. So one that basically keeps running in the background just the way that we've learned before. This async function then returns a promise, but more on that a bit later. For now, what's important is that inside an async function, we can have one or more await expressions. So in order to consume our first promise, we can do it like this. We simply say const IDs await get IDs. So this get IDs here is our first promise, right? So get IDs is this promise here. And then to consume it, we simply say await IDs and assign the result to this IDs variable. And what happens here is that this await expression here will really stop the code from executing at this point until the promise is fulfilled. So in this case, this get IDs promise. And if the promise is resolved, which remember means that it was successful, then the value of the await expression is the resolved value of the promise, which is then assigned to this IDs variable. Okay, so again, in this case, our promise will resolve to this value here, so this array, and so this IDs here will then become the value of that resolved value, so that array that I just showed you. Okay, and to demonstrate this to you, let me then just simply log this to the console. So IDs. Run it, and let's see it, and here we go. So after 1.5 seconds, we log the resolved value of the get IDs promise. Okay, and so again, what happens here is that we fire off the function, so we start the function, and it then keeps running asynchronously in the background. And then here, we wait for this promise here to resolve, assign the value to this IDs variable, and then simply log it to the console. Now, if the promise is rejected, then an error will be thrown. And if you want to handle that error, we have to include some more code here, but that's not really important for now at this point. And so I'm leaving that for the next lecture. Okay, so let's now consume our other two promises. So this one I'm going to call a recipe, and we will await the result of our next promise. And that one we get simply by calling get recipe, just like this here, right? So we have our get recipe function, right? Which is this one here, which will then return a promise. And so we await that that promise finishes. And after it finishes, we can then log the recipe to the console. And now the next one, let's simply call it a related and await the next one. So we can actually use, again, this code here. And that's it. So let's check it out here. And this should work the exact same way as before. And yeah, here we go. So here we have our result, just like we had when we consumed the promise in this way here. Okay, and I think that this way here is really a lot easier. So all we do is to simply await until each of these promises here gets resolved. And in each of these lines where we use the await keyword, the execution stops and we wait until a promise returns. So that's how async await works. It allows us to consume promises, but without all the callbacks that we have with the callback hell, and to some degree also in promises with the then and the catch methods. Now I just want to make it very clear again that the await expression can only be used inside an async function, okay? And this async function, remember, it runs in the background. And that's very important because we can never have the main code stopping. And so all we do here is to block the code in the async function, which runs in the background anyway, okay? And so again, stopping the function here is not a problem because it just runs in the background anyway, okay? So in here, in this line of code, we synchronously call this getRecipes function, which then does all this stuff here just in the background, okay? Now, this is all really great already. Now, just imagine that we actually wanted to return a value here from this async function. So let's try something which is not going to work, but I'm going to show you anyway. So let's say that we want to return the recipe. So we can assign then this return value here to this result, right? And then we can log it to the console. Now this is not really going to work, right? So let me show it to you. So all these logs here is this promise, and it says pending here. And so that's not really the result that we were looking for. We were hoping that it would log to the console the result of the recipe. So basically this here, right? And so why didn't this work? Well, it doesn't work because this function here runs asynchronously in the background. And so by the time that we try to run this console.log here, this getRecipe function is still running in the background. And so all that is logged is this promise here, which simply says, well, this rec here, it is a promise, but we don't have any result yet, and so we cannot log anything to the console, right? Because remember that this code here is of course run synchronously, right? And so it runs this here, then it puts it off to the background, and then immediately it will run this next line. But by the time we run it, this getRecipes function here will still be doing its job and will then log this data here long after this line here has already run, okay? So how could we actually solve this problem? Well, remember how I told you a bit earlier that an async function always automatically returns a promise. And so if we return a value from the async function using the return keyword, so just like I did here, then the promise will automatically be resolved with this returned value, okay? Now this may sound a bit confusing, but it's very straightforward. So let me just show it to you. So this one here doesn't really work, but what we can do here is to then simply use the then method, just like we did before. Because again, this function here automatically returns a promise with the resolved value of recipe. And so we can now use this then, into which we pass a callback function where the argument is the resolved value of the promise. So let's just say a recipe here, or result, it doesn't really matter, let's just call it result, okay, why not? And then we can simply console.log this result to the console. And we can maybe add some more text so that it's different from this one here. So let's use the backticks here. Then we of course need these curly braces. Is the best ever. So something like this. And so now let's test it again. And wait for it. And here we go. So fresh tomato pasta is the best ever. And so now it works just the way we wanted it to work, right? And so what we did here is to use then, which is basically to consume this promise, just like I showed you before up here, right? Which is possible simply because of the fact that this async function here always returns a promise that we can then consume. Okay, and we will actually need to use this trick here later in the big project that we're going to code. And so it's important that you familiarize yourself with this piece of code and that you really understand and that it makes sense to you at this point. Okay, so I hope you saw that async await makes it so much easier to work with promises. And that's just because of the fact that it looks like the normal synchronous code that we're already used to. It just works in an asynchronous way behind the scenes. Okay, so again, this really looks like synchronous JavaScript code that we've been written all the time. We just need to understand that behind the scenes, because of this async and await, this is asynchronous code. But as long as we understand how and why all of this works, we can now use this fantastic new tool to our advantage. So we've been throwing around words like AJAX and API throughout this section, but before we move on, let's just take a second to understand what these terms actually mean. So AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, and basically it allows us to asynchronously communicate with remote servers. So let's say we have our JavaScript app running in the browser, which is called the client, and we want the app to get some data from our server, but of course without having to reload the entire page. Well, with AJAX, we can do a simple GET HTTP request to our server, which will then send back a response containing the data that we requested. And this all happens asynchronously in the background, just the way we learned before. Also, of course, this not only works for getting data from the server, but also to send data to the server by doing a POST request rather than a GET request. Now, in practice, there are many ways in which we can do AJAX in JavaScript, and we're going to look at the Fetch Web API in the next lecture, which will allow us to make some AJAX calls in a very easy way. Alright, and since we were talking about servers, we also have to talk about APIs. So, API stands for Application Programming Interface, and on a very high level, it's basically a piece of software that can be used by another piece of software in order to basically allow applications to talk to each other. And that's not just valid for web development in JavaScript, but for programming in general, okay? But now in reference to web development and AJAX and servers, well, the API is not the server itself, but it's like a part of the server, like an application that receives requests and sends back responses. So let's distinguish between two types of APIs that you can use in JavaScript, which are your own APIs or external third-party APIs. So let's imagine for a second that you're building a traveling app, and you have a database with different destinations and tours that you're offering. So on your server, you could build your own API that can receive requests from your front-end app in JavaScript and send back the results. So that would be your own API hosted on your own server. But now you also need some current weather information for each destination, which you don't have in your database, and so you can use a third-party API to get that weather data. Okay, that makes sense, right? And there are actually all kinds of third-party APIs out there, like to include Google Maps into your app, or to embed YouTube videos, to get data about movies, or even to send emails or text messages from within your app. There are really endless possibilities, and that's why APIs are getting so popular in web development. Okay? So these are the very fundamentals about AJAX and APIs, but it's all you need to know in order to get started. So let's move on now and use some AJAX in practice. Welcome back. And this is a very exciting lecture, because now you're finally going to use all the skills you learned about asynchronous JavaScript in order to make an AJAX call to request some weather data from a real weather API. And in order to do this, we're going to use a modern web API called Fetch. And by web API, I mean these parts that are available to us in the browser, but are not really part of the JavaScript language itself. Remember that from the event loop lecture? Anyway, with Fetch, we can do AJAX in a very simple way. So we can do asynchronous network requests across the internet to fetch data from other servers or even from our own server. Okay, so that's just what we talked about in the last lecture, right? Now, we used to do this in JavaScript using the rather complex XML HTTP request interface, and maybe you have heard of that. It has actually better browser support than Fetch because it's been around for a long time now. But I'm still going to use Fetch right now here in this lecture, which is more modern, and it should work more than fine for us here. And so let's test it out now. So I'm going to get rid of this code here first, just like before. Okay, and so all we have to do is really to use the fetch function. So just like this. Now in here, we need to pass the URL where the API is located. So basically the URL to which we are sending the request. Now we are using a weather API called MetaWeather. So let's now talk a bit about that one. So I already have it here open. So it's on metaweather.com/API. And this page here is basically a simple documentation of this API. So normally APIs request a key in order to use it, but this one is a very simple one and it doesn't require an API key. And so that's why I chose this very simple MetaWeather API. Okay, so down here we have the documentation, and we can see here that there are 3 methods in this API. So the first one here is to search for locations. Basically, you put in the name like of a city or something, and it then comes back with a result which contains these fields here in the response. So the title of the location, the type, the latitude and longitude, this ID here, which means where on Earth ID, and then this distance here. Okay, now this is not the one that we want to use, but we want to use this location method here. And this is basically to get the weather data from a certain where on Earth ID. So this ID here that corresponds to a place on Earth. Okay, and so this is the API method, or the API endpoint, which we can also call it, that we're interested in. And down here we have some examples. And so let's check it out. This one here for San Francisco, which is actually the one that we're going to use. So let's open it in a new tab. And then you see this response. Now maybe for you it looks like this in the browser. So probably this is here what you see. But I have this very handy Chrome extension installed, which is called JSON Viewer. And so it makes it nicely formatted and more easy to read, just like this. So you see here that this is the URL of the API call. So metaweather/API/location, which is the endpoint, so which is the method that we're using. And then we also pass in the where on Earth ID, which is this number here, right? So just following the format that we have here in this documentation, okay? So what we get back then is this object here, which is not really an object, but it's called JSON, okay? And so JSON is a text-based data format, which is very similar to JavaScript objects, but the difference is that JSON is really just a single string and not an entire object inside the JavaScript engine, okay? So this is like a string that we can receive from the server, and we can then easily convert it to a JavaScript object. And I'm going to show you how that works just in a second when we start using this API. For now, let's just take a look at the result here. And what we have is the first field is the consolidated weather. And so we get an array of the weather in different days. So the first one is for March 15. And you see the minimum temperature, max, wind speed, wind direction, air pressure, and all the good stuff like that. Then we have the same for March 16, 17, 18, and 19. Yeah, and even 20. So I think it's a forecast for 5 days that we get. And then beside that array, we also have the current time, the sunrise, sunset, the time zone, and all of this data here. Okay, so we can get all of this just by calling the API on this location endpoint with this ID here. So basically with this parameter. So this works kind of a parameter that we pass into the API simply by using it in the URL that we call. Okay, so let's actually use this one here. And so all we need to do is to pass this one into the fetch. Okay, as a string. And here we go. That's it. Now it looks a bit weird because this moved to a new line here. So ideally it would be like on one line looking like this. Okay, but we have no space for that. So that's just how it looks. Now just to test what happens here, let's take a look at it. Okay, and so now we get this weird error here saying no access control allow origin header is present on the requested resource. So what is this strange error? Well, the reason for this is the so-called same origin policy in JavaScript, which basically prevents us from making AJAX requests to a domain different than our own domain. So right now we don't really have any domain here, we're just opening the JavaScript file, okay? And the domain that we're requesting this resource from is of course the MetaWeather API. And so because of this same origin policy, we can then not access this resource, okay? Now in order to actually allow developers to make requests to different domains, something called cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS, was developed. And I don't want to bore you with all the details here, but in simple terms, the developers of the API that we're requesting from, they need to implement CORS on their server. And that's actually the case for many APIs, but unfortunately not for MetaWeather, okay? So this is kind of a problem, but we can actually still fortunately solve this. So what developers usually do is to proxy or to channel the request through their own server, like doing the AJAX requests on our own server where the same origin policy doesn't exist, and then send the data to the browser. So that is just a workaround to that problem. But of course, we're not going to do that here because we don't have our own server in this example, and of course we want to keep it simple, but we can still use a service that does exactly that for us. And so we're going to use a proxy called crossorigin.me. Let me actually show it to you. And that's misspelled. So crossorigin.me. And so here it says what it does. So a CORS proxy is a service that allows developers to access resources from other websites without having to own that website. And it's actually very easy to use. All we have to do is to prefix our own request URL with this crossorigin.me. So let's test that and put it here. And that should actually be enough already. Let's reload it. And now we don't get any error. But we also don't get any result, right? And that's because we didn't yet handle the result of this fetch function, okay? So we simply fired off the request, but then that's really all we did. We didn't handle any responses or anything like that. So let's now take care of that. Okay, and what you need to know is that the fetch API gets our data and returns a promise. And this promise can, of course, either return the data that we want or an error if it couldn't somehow find the data that we requested. And so now we can use the then and catch methods on this promise, just like I showed you in the last lectures. So remember how I mentioned that most of the time we actually just consume promises and do not really produce them. And this is a great example of that. So fetch here, it automatically returns a promise without us having to write the promise ourselves. So we're just consuming it here. And so let's now use the then method on it. And also the catch. So our callback function here has one argument, and that is the result value of the promise. Remember that? So let's just call it something like result. Okay, and so this means that the data that comes back from this fetch AJAX request will be called result here in this callback function. Okay, and so let's simply log it to the console. Console.log the result. And let's also add the callback here for the case that there was an error. And let's just log it to the console also. Let's see how that works. And all right, so now you see this response object here. So it has all of these fields here, but what really matters to us is this body field. And what you see now here is that this is a readable stream. Okay, so that's a bit weird. And what this means is that we first have to process this response here with JSON so that we can then get the actual result that we're looking for. Okay, so the body here is where the actual result is stored, but it's now as a readable stream. And so we actually have to convert it from JSON to JavaScript, just like I mentioned before. And how we do that? Well, it's actually very easy. We just use the JSON method on this result. And this JSON method, it also actually returns a promise. And so we have to handle the result of that. And so again, we use the then method, and we also chain it like we did in a lecture before. Remember that? So just like before, we can return a promise here and then add a new then method right after this. So chaining or asynchronous operations here, one after the other. So let's return result.json, okay? And so this here will return a promise because this actually happens asynchronously, this conversion to JSON, because it can take some time. And so therefore it happens asynchronously in the background. And as soon as it's ready, it then comes back with the data. And so we need to handle that. And so we add a new then method. Okay, and so let's call this one here data now. And let's simply log it to the console once more. Okay, let's fire it off. And here we go. So that is our JavaScript object now containing the data that we were looking for. Great, right? So we just did our very first AJAX call using fetch and promises. Okay, and if we now take a look at this, this should be the exact data that we had here in this example, right? So you have the weather data here, which is an array. So consolidated weather, then this array with all of these days, and then the remaining data that we had here. And you see that this is still San Francisco. Okay, so all that we need is actually right here. Now to make this a bit more fun, let's actually log something more exciting to the console than just this entire object, okay? So we don't want to log all of this to the console, but instead let's just get this weather here for the first day and then log some string to the console telling how the weather is today. So const today is data, because that's this entire object here. Then we have a consolidated weather, and let's just copy this one from here. So remember that this is the array, and then today is of course the first one. So number 0. So that is today. And so let's log to the console some kind of string. So we're using template strings here. Temperatures in, and let's add the name of the city. And you see that this one is stored in this title. Okay, so we have data.title, stay between, and so now let's just use the max temperature and the min temperature. So it is min and max. So min temperature, let's just write it out, okay, that's easier. So we have today dot min temp and today dot max temp. All right, let's check it out. It takes some time to get the data, and then temperatures in San Francisco stay between 7.52 and 1136 degrees Celsius. So this is probably in degrees Celsius here, which is what we use outside the US, as you probably know. So great. Let's just put this here maybe in a function. So let's just say function get weather, and then we pass an where on earth ID into it. So to make this a bit more like reusable. So get weather, and then we use this one here as our ID. And so in here we just want this ID. So let's use a template string here. Oh, that's not, yeah. All right, so let's take a look at here at the example. And so another one here was London. Okay, and so the ID here is this one. And so let's just call it now for London as well. So get weather. And so let's test it out now. And it's okay. So San Francisco, the first one, and the second one is London. So it's working just fine. Now let's just see what happens if we put some weird number here that doesn't really return any result. So something like this, which is probably not a valid ID. So let's see. And so what we get here first is a 404. So basically this means that it didn't find anything. And so that's an error coming right from line 98. So right from this fetch function here. But then we also get this error here, which is a type error, cannot read property 0 of undefined. And so that one comes from line 108. And so that means that somewhere here in this chain, there was an error. And so we could now add some more logic here in this catch method to actually handle that error properly. Okay, but this was just to show you an example. What we really want is, of course, for this to work just fine. And that's it. That's a very simple AJAX call using fetch and promises using then and the catch methods. So I hope that made sense to you, how we use fetch, how we handle the result, and how we convert it here to JSON, which returns this new promise. Then down here, we simply analyze the response, and based on that, we then simply printed these pieces of data to the console that we're interested in here. And so this is how you do it with the then and catch method to handle this promise. But in the next lecture, I'm going to show you how we can use async await again to handle the data that comes back from the server. And so once again, you will see that it's actually much easier and nicer to use also. So stay tuned for that next lecture. After doing an AJAX call with fetch and ES6 promises in the last lecture, let's now use async await to consume the promises in an easier way. So what we're interested in here is to create an asynchronous version of this same function that we did in the last lecture. So let's call this one here async function getWeather, then AW for async await, and again the war on earth ID. Okay, and then let's also call it just like we did here for the first one. Now, how do we do the code here using async await? Well, it's actually not hard at all. So let's first of all copy this line of code here because it's going to be the same. And so this is the one that actually fetches the data. Now with async await, remember we don't use then and catch, but instead we use await. So we create a new variable, const result, and then await the fetch. So the fetch will then get the data from the server while the execution here in this function stops, and then once it's done, so once the promise is fulfilled, it will then assign the result of this promise here to this variable. Okay, and that's it. So the execution stops here, and then it goes to the next line. And so what we want to do now is just like we did before, is to then create this to JSON using the .json method. Okay, and that's also very simple because it is also a promise. And so we are simply going to await it. So again, let me call it data here and await the result .json. Okay, does that make sense? And finally, we will just log it to the console. Let's actually remove this logging here from this one so that we only end up with the strings. And here we go. So these are our two results for both London and San Francisco. Great. So once again, this is working, this time with async await. So in a much easier way, I think, than what we had up here. Okay. Once again, because it looks like it is synchronous code, while in reality it's not. All that really happens is that the function is called, and then in the background it runs all of this code that we have here. And so it's okay that the code stops here with the await expression, because this entire function here is running in the background anyway, and so it's not blocking the main thread that's running in the JavaScript engine. Okay, and so here we have our two sequential promises, which are both awaited. First this one, and then this one, and finally we log it to the console. Now let's do something similar to this one here. So just that we end up with a similar structure. And so, yeah, let's log it. And so we are sure that everything works the same. And so you see that for London, it's the same. For San Francisco, it's the same. Now let's just change it a bit to, we actually want it to tomorrow. And so we need the second element of this weather array. So let's add it here to the also tomorrow. And then up here we can say temperatures today. Take a look at it. And oh, okay, here we have an error now. And actually that's a good time for showing you how to handle errors with async await. So remember that I told you before that in order to handle errors with async await, we cannot use, of course, this catch method. But instead we use something else. And I told you I would show it to you later, and so now let me do that. And so this has actually nothing to do with async await, but it's just something that is available to us in JavaScript, which is called try catch. So let me just show you how it works, and then I explain it to you afterwards. So we basically wrap all our code into a try statement. And so this code here will all get executed, but if there is an error, then it will be catched. And so we add this catch statement here, and then we say what we want to happen when there is an error. And so let's once more just log the error to the console. Okay, so this is called the try catch statement again, and so it tries to execute this code, but if there is an error, then it will jump here to this part. And so let's try what happens now. Okay, and so now it doesn't really throw these errors, so it's not red like it was before, but it simply logged these to the console like this. And we can also say alert instead of logging it, and so that will like create this window. Okay, and so now you see here the today is not defined, and you don't see the error here in the console at all. Okay, and so we catch that error here with this part of the catch statement. Okay, now let's actually fix this error that we had here, because it's of course not today, but tomorrow. And so let's see what happens now. And all right, so we have the weather for San Francisco both today and tomorrow, and the same for London. And it doesn't really appear in the same order here. So we called San Francisco first and London second, but for some reason the data for London came back first, and only then San Francisco came back. And so that's why it then happens here in this order, but that's not a problem at all. That's just a good proof that actually this function here runs in the background, okay? And so the results do not appear in the order that they were called, so that they are here in the code. Okay, so this is just working just fine. Now, a final thing is that I want to show you is that we want to return some data from this function. And you already know that an async function always returns a promise. And so let's use that. So let's return the entire data here. And so you already know that what we return from an async function will be the resolved value of the promise that this function here returns, right? So that's what we talked about in the last async await lecture. And so let's pretend that we want to actually store this data for this London. And let me show you how it's not going to work. So data London get weather AW. And then let's try to log it to the console. Data London. Okay, and again, this is not going to work, and I want you to think why it doesn't work. And so you already see the result here. So again, it says just the promise here and not really the result that we wanted. And that's again because this console.log statement here happens way before this data actually comes back. And so we run this function at a time where we don't already have that data. Now, if we want this to really work, then we need to use the then method in order to handle the result value of this promise, right? So let's actually do it the other way around. So we need to declare this at a variable that is not constant. And so for that, we use let, remember? And we can then very simply handle the result of the promise. So data. And now we can say that we want data London to be equal to the data that came back. Right? So what will happen now? Let's take a look. And well, of course, it still didn't work because it's now undefined, because this here, of course, still happens only after this console log here finished running. So if we wanted to really log it, then I guess we would have to make a bigger function here. All right, and so now it is going to work. So that's the data for London here. So does it make sense? Again, this is because this async function here returns a promise, right? And the data that we return from this async function will be the resolved value of that promise. And so we can have access to it by using the then method on this promise here, right? Then we can log it like we did here. And then of course play around with the data as we wish. All right, so this is actually something that we're going to use later in the project. And it's also important to notice here for your own projects in the future. And so yeah, I wanted to really show you how this works once again. And so now we did AJAX calls using both promises and async await. And so you're now ready to start working on the big project that's coming up right in the next section. So I hope to see you there real soon. Welcome back to the next real-world project. So now it's time to use everything that you learned about ES6 and asynchronous JavaScript in order to build yet another beautiful real project. This time interacting with a real API to fetch and display some real food recipe data. And along the way, you're also going to be using some modern JavaScript tools that every modern developer uses these days. Things like Webpack to bundle together JavaScript modules, and Babel to convert ES6 code back to ES5. So besides applying all these cool ES6, ES7 and ES8 features to a real context, we're also going to be building a modern workflow that you can use in all your future projects. So this is really exciting stuff, and this is by far my favorite project in the course. And so I can't wait to show it to you now. Hey there, how are you doing today? So I hope that you've been learning JavaScript like crazy and finished this course with a deep understanding of how the language works and everything we can do with it in the browser. Now maybe you are aware of the fact that we can actually also use JavaScript outside of the browser. And the most popular way of doing so is by using a technology called Node.js, which we can use to create web servers and build the backends of our web applications. So in this bonus section, I want to give you a very brief crash course into Node.js by building a simple project using this modern and quite popular technology. Because in fact, we will still be using JavaScript. And so I thought it made perfect sense to include this topic as a bonus to the complete JavaScript course. So this is a small project that we're going to build with the terrible name, the laptop store. Okay, and so we have these 5 laptops here, and this page is actually completely generated on a Node.js web server. Okay, so when we click this button here, notice how the URL changes from product to laptop with the ID of 0. And so this laptop here has the ID 0. We can go back, and then Node.js again generates this page here. Then when we check out the second one, this one has the ID number 1. And as you can guess, this one will have the ID number 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so again, all of these are automatically generated by Node.js. And so that is exactly what we're going to build throughout this small crash course. So I hope that sounds and looks super exciting to you. And so let's now dive right in and start by getting a quick idea of what Node.js actually is. So the official definition is that Node.js is a JavaScript runtime built on the V8 JavaScript engine. Now that sounds a bit crazy, so what does it actually mean? Well, let's start by trying to understand what a JavaScript runtime and the V8 engine are. So as I mentioned in the beginning, if you have used JavaScript before, it was probably always just inside a browser, right? Because any browser natively understands HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And no matter if you write vanilla JavaScript or React or Angular, that's all just JavaScript that gets executed right in the browser. So in this case, the browser is a JavaScript runtime. But what if we could take JavaScript out of the browser and simply execute our code somewhere else, without all the restrictions that we have in the browser? Well, it turns out that we actually can, and the solution for this, as you can guess by now, is called Node.js. And so Node.js is just another JavaScript runtime. It's just like a container, like an environment in which a program written in JavaScript can be executed, but outside of any browser whatsoever. Alright? It's actually a bit more complex than that, of course, but for now, this is enough. Now, who actually does execute the code if not the browser? And that's where the V8 engine developed by Google comes into play. because that is exactly where JavaScript code will be parsed and run in Node.js. Okay? So I hope that the definition of Node.js being a JavaScript runtime built on a V8 engine makes a lot more sense to you now. And again, remember that this is just a very high-level overview of what Node is and how it works. But in this small crash course, all I want is to really just give you a quick idea of what Node is and what amazing things we can do with it. Anyway, now that we have JavaScript outside of the browser in a kind of standalone environment, which is Node.js, we can do so much more things with JavaScript that were completely impossible before, like accessing the file system or better networking capabilities are now possible with Node.js. And all these factors together give us the perfect conditions for using Node.js as a web server, meaning that now we can finally use JavaScript on the server side of web development in order to build fast, highly scalable network applications for powering the back end of our websites or applications. Okay, and so let's do exactly that in the next video, where we're going to start building that project that I showed you. So I hope you're excited for that, and see you in a second. Okay, so let's now start building the laptop store using Node.js. And the first thing that you need to do is to actually go ahead and download Node.js for your computer. So just head over to nodejs.org and then download probably version 10 here. Okay, so that's the most stable version right now. And if you don't find the download for your operating system here, you can just go here to downloads and it's going to be there for sure. And if you already have Node installed on your computer, please just make sure that it's at least version 8 or better 10. Okay? And to quickly determine the version you're on, you just need to head over to the terminal and type node-v. Okay, and so it gives me 10.11, and so I'm at least on version number 10. Then after doing that, just download the starter files for this project, as usual from the course GitHub repo. Okay, and I'm gonna leave a link to that here in this video, but you can also find it right at the beginning of the course. As you see, I already have it opened here. And so all we really have here is this data.json, which is all the data that will be in our laptop store. I have the images, so one image for each of the laptops, and then also the HTML web pages for both the overview and the detail view of each laptop. Okay? All right, and now that you have Node installed on your computer, you can actually run JavaScript outside of the browser for the very first time. So increase this here, clear the console, and so all we have to do is to write in the terminal Node. And so now we're running JavaScript outside of the browser. And this is now basically like a JavaScript console, just like you have in the browser. So we can do JavaScript like 1 + 1, and it will of course give us the result. We can do console logs, for example. And now you notice that I have like this shortcut here on my computer. So when I type "col", then it will write console log automatically. Okay, so I'm going to use that for now. Anyway, you see that this is just JavaScript like you already know. Okay, so good old console log works here in the Node console just as it works in the browser. Now, of course, we don't want to write all of our Node code here in this command line, and so we can create a new JavaScript file to do just that, like we usually do. So creating a new file, and I'm calling this one index.js. Now, what's that? Doesn't really matter. And by the way, if I want to exit this command line here, I just have to type Control-C and then Control-C again. Okay, and that's it. Now let's do the same thing that we did here before in the console, but in this file. So console.log hello world. And now to run this file, I write Node again and then index.js. And this works because I'm already in this folder. So this long path here, and so this index.js file is right in that home folder. And so we have to return, and then it runs the file. Okay, simple as that. So what happened here? Well, Node run our file, and all we have here is the console log. So it does that here to the console, and then it actually exits the process because it has nothing else to do. And so we're back to our normal command line here in the terminal. So imagine we wanted to add a second console log here. And then we would have to run this all over again. Okay, and this is kind of annoying. So the first thing that you want to do when you start working with Node.js is to install a little tool, like a little helper called NodeMon. Okay, and for that we use npm, just as I showed you before in the last part of the course, where I showed you how to use npm and install packages and all that good stuff. So npm install NodeMon, and we can actually install it globally. So -g. And if you're on a Mac, you're probably going to need sudo here in front to give it the admin rights. Okay. Now I'm not going to install this because I already have it, but you should go ahead and do that. Okay. So let me get rid of this. And now instead of typing node in Next.js, all I have to do is to type nodemon. And it will automatically figure out which file I want to run, and then it actually runs it. Okay, so you see here in the log, starting node index.js, which is exactly what we did here before when we did it manually. Now it happens automatically. Okay, and if you now add a third log here, give it a save, and you see it runs automatically here without us having to go ahead and run this again and again each time that we save something. So this is going to save us a ton of time. All right, so this was more the setup of Node.js on our system. Now let's actually start doing something cool. And the first thing that we will do is to read the content of this JSON file here, all right? And then parse it into a JavaScript object. And again, this is something that you really cannot do with a normal, let's say, a JavaScript in the browser, because it doesn't give us access to a file system. But with Node.js, we can. So let me show you how to do it. So get rid of all of this. And the first thing that you need to do is that Node comes with a very powerful module system. And most of the functionality that we have in Node is always in one of the Node packages. So now that we want to read a file, we need to require the file system module. Okay? So we define a variable. In this case, it's going to be fs, which stands for file system, and equal require and then the name of the module, which is fs. And so usually we give the variable name here fs the same as the package name. Okay, so the module name. And this is a so-called core Node modules, because we can actually also use other modules like the ones that we get from npm, but the file system module is something that already comes with Node.js. And so now we're ready to actually load a file. And we do that by saying fs.read file, and we use the synchronous version here. Okay, and so read file here is a method of fs. So and that's why we had to actually save the result of requiring the module in this variable, so that we can now use this method here that is on that variable. Okay, and so where is that file located? Well, it is here in the data folder and then data.json. Okay, but it's actually not that simple, because we have to pass like the absolute path to that file. And in Node.js, we have a variable name called dir name. Okay, so it's simply called dir name like this. Okay, and since we're using a template string here, because of these backticks here, remember that's something that comes from ES6. We just have to do it like this. Okay, and so this will then get the dir name variable that is defined in Node.js for us. Okay, and so this dir name is basically the home folder, so to say. Okay, so we have dir name /data/data.json. And then we also need to specify the character encoding. Okay, and so that's going to be UTF-8. Okay, and if you don't specify this, then instead of returning a file, it will return something called a buffer. All right, and so finally what we have to do is to then save the result of this into a variable. So let's simply say JSON. Okay, and now let's take a look at this JSON variable with a simple console.log. And since we're doing console logs, let me also show you the dir name variable, just so you know what I was actually talking about. Okay, give it a save now, and here we go. So here is the JSON data that we just read from the file. And you will see that what we have here is exactly what we had here. Amazing, right? So now we can use JavaScript to read files from the disk. And up here you also see the path to this file basically. So index.js is in this huge folder. Okay, so let's get rid of this. And what we actually need is not just like this JSON text, but we want to parse it into an object that we can use in JavaScript. And so we actually want what I'm going to call laptop data, which we will parse with JSON. So in JavaScript, there's this JSON.parse method that we can pass any JSON string, let's say, and then it will return an object for us. All right. And I think we actually used this before in another project in this course when we worked with an API. Because APIs usually always work with JSON these days, at least the traditional REST APIs. All right. And now instead of logging JSON, let's actually log our laptop data. And so down here it is. And you see that now it's no longer this string that we had, but it really is a JavaScript object. And so with that, we are ready to start working on implementing this laptop store. Awesome. So we learned how to read files. Now let's actually do what Node.js was really intended to do, which is to create web servers. All right. So for that, we're going to need another package, so another core module. And this one is called HTTP. So again, we're using the variable name as the same one as the module name, require, and HTTP. Get rid of this console.log, and now let's create our server. And so all we have to do is to create a variable called server, and then on the HTTP object, use the create server method. Okay, and there are different ways of doing this, different kinds of writing this, but I think that this one for now and for learning is the easiest one. All right, and in this create server, we have to pass in a callback function. And this callback function is the one that's going to be fired each time that someone accesses our web server. So each time someone opens a page that's on our server. All right, and this callback function gets access to the request and to the response objects. And more about that later. All right. So we're using an arrow function here, of course, because the Node, just like most browsers these days, also understands ES6, of course. ES6, ES7, ES9, ES8, in all of these versions. They're all kind of well supported in Node.js at this point. Okay, so this creates a server, and remember, this callback function, it is what is run each time that someone accesses our web server. So for now, let's just log to the console. Someone did access the server. Okay, and that is the first part of creating the server. Now the second part is that we actually have to listen on a specific port and a specific IP address. Okay, and again, I'm not going to go into deep explanations here in this quick crash course. Okay, so all we're going to do here is to really try to implement this small project. Okay, and so how this works is that we take the server that we just created here, okay, so this variable here, and then we use the listen method on it. And so this will basically tell Node.js to always keep listening on a certain port on a certain IP address, okay? And so I'm going to use port 1337, and this is kind of a standard in Node. You will also see 3000, 8000, maybe 80. There are some kind of standards, but I'm just going to go with this one here. So that is the port, and now we need the IP address as well. And what we usually do is to use localhost. Okay, so localhost means the current computer, so the computer that the program is right now running on. Okay, and so localhost gets this standard IP address that I'm sure you have seen before. So 127.0.0.1. Okay, and then as soon as we start listening, also this callback function here gets fired. And this is not mandatory. This is just so we know that the server has started listening, okay? So let's just say that we're listening for requests now, okay? And what we did here, which is the most important part, is to pass in this callback function, which will get fired each time that someone accesses the server, okay? And now in order for this to actually start running, we need to actually listen. So basically to look for incoming requests at port 3037 of this IP address. Okay, and so let's save this. And now we get listening for requests now. And so let's actually do a request so that we can see if this actually works. And the simplest way of doing that is to actually just use a browser. So we're gonna go to this IP and this port and see if it works. 0. And it's actually already here, so just not with this part. And so we see that it's loading, and it doesn't do actually anything right now because we don't have any code here. Okay, in here we don't have any code except the console log, and that actually worked. So someone did access the server. Now this here keeps loading because we're not sending back any result from the server to the browser right now. Okay, and so this will keep spinning here until it eventually times out. Okay, but what we know is that it actually now works because we got this message here logged to our console. So we can now get rid of this console.log here and actually send a response back from the server. Okay, so just that the page can actually then load something instead of spinning until infinity. Okay, and that is where this response object here comes into play, because both the request and the response objects have certain methods and properties on them that we can now use in order to, in this case, to send a response back to the browser. Okay, so we can use res and then end. Okay, and this is not send, it really is end. And it's end because we can do a couple of things before this. But for now, let's keep it at this. And so let's just say res end and then just some text in here. So this is the response. Okay, so one of the things that we can do before, like I mentioned, is to set a header. Okay, so an HTTP header. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with headers, but they're just like a small message that we send with a request to let the browser know what kind of data is coming in. Okay, so we can say write head and then an HTTP status code, and I write 200 for OK, and then the content type. And it works like this. So we basically pass an object here with some options. So content type. And so let's say that what we're going to send back here will be HTML. Okay, and so this HTTP status code is something that you probably see. For example, if we have an error, we usually have a 404. You know that one, right? And if everything works just fine, then 200 is like a standard for that. Okay, so just a small recap of what's happening here. So each time someone is accessing our server, we will have a response. And to that response, we write a header. Okay, in this case, saying that we have a response so that everything is okay, and that's the 200, and then the content type saying that it's going to be text HTML. And then we also send the response itself. And that always has to happen after setting the header. All right, and so let's see what happens now in this case. So this is what we want, and here we go. So this is the response. What I wanted to do is to show you the network, the network tab. We have to reload this actually to work. And so here you see the status code that we sent back. So the 200, okay. If I were to say 404, and now do it again, then you will see status 404, and it's actually also in red here, saying that we have an error. Okay, the response is still the same. Okay, but this just changed the status code of this response simply because we sent a different header. Okay, so just to show you the difference here. So this is the very, very basic functionality of handling requests and sending back responses. Now, before finishing this video, I want to implement something called routing. Okay, and what routing means is that we basically respond in different ways for different URLs. Okay, because right now, no matter what URL we actually have on our server, like this, so we can write something like this, and it doesn't really matter, it will always send back the same response. Okay, it doesn't matter what URL we have here, all right, because we're not responding to that here. We don't have any routing in place. So whatever URL we have, we always send back the same response. But what we really want, and that is what routing really is to respond differently to these different URLs. So for example, here we have /product, and so then we have this overview of all the different products. But if we then click here, we have laptop. So we have /laptop, and so we see the detail page for this specific laptop, okay? And then we also have the ID parameter here, which in this case is 0. But if it was 1, then we would also respond in a different way, because we would now have laptop number 1, laptop number 2, and so on and so forth. And so that exactly is routing. It's responding in different ways to different URLs. All right, and so we go back and we are back to products. And even if we don't have anything here, I also routed that one, so to this same overview. Okay, makes sense? So let's now quickly implement that. And for that, we will have to look at the URL. And so we're going to use a tool for that. So just another Node module. So again, Node comes built in with this functionality that we're going to use, and it's in the URL module. So require, and then URL. And so let's now use this. And where do you think we should use it? Well, it should be right here in this server callback function here. So right in this function. And that is because that's the function that's going to be fired each time that someone accesses the server, right? And so that will always be a different URL. And so this is, of course, where we want to analyze that URL. Okay, and so what we can do is to say URL.parse, and then where is the URL actually stored? Well, now we're going to use the request object for the first time, because that is where the URL is actually stored. And actually, let's comment out this part here and start by having a console log of the request object, just so you get an overview of all the information that we get each time that someone makes a request. So let's reload here. And so this here, all this data that you see, all of this is the request data. Okay, so there's a ton of stuff in here, and somewhere in here is also our URL. So let's actually say URL, do it again, and then here it is. So this is the URL that we typed in here, right? If we just do like products now, just like this, well, then it should say /products. Okay, and we could now actually go ahead and use this one here, but this doesn't quite give us enough functionality, and that is why we use the URL module. Okay, so this here, what we did here, does not even require the URL module that we required up here. Okay, but now it is actually time to use that one, and so I'm going to show you why here in a second. So we will do URL parse of the rec, so of the request URL. Okay, and then we also have to specify a second argument, which is true, which will simply make it so that the query is parsed into an object. Okay, so const, and I'm going to call this one here query. And so let's now log what that actually will do. Do it again. And so now, instead of just getting this product string here, we get all of this different stuff here, which for now is probably not so useful, but you will see later why we really need all of this here. Okay, so right now we're actually just interested in the path name here. Okay, so basically what we had here, so we could use in this stage just rec.url without using the URL module here. But again, you're going to see in a second why we actually need this URL.parse. Okay, so this is actually not called query, but I'm going to call it path name. And so what we want here is just the path name. All right, so dot path name. And so let's now just quickly take a look at that, reload, and it should give us products. All right, here we go. And with this, we can actually already start implementing some very simple routing, because all we have to do is to now do an if-else statement. So we can say, if the path name is equal to product, then we can do a certain response for that. And later it will, of course, be all of these different computers, all of this data that we get from this JSON file that we imported right here in the beginning. But for now, just for testing, let's simply write here what we have. So this is the products page. Okay. Else if And let's give us some more space here. We can actually do it like this. It doesn't have to be right here after the first if. And so we can say path name if it is equal to laptop. And here I forgot the slash. It always has the slash in the path name. Okay, so this one is for product and this one is for laptop. So we have laptop, and we're going to take care of that part here in a second. And we have products. And then we also have the products when there's nothing. Okay, so let's also quickly implement that. So if the path name is products, or if the path name is just empty. So in either of these two cases, we will have the product page. And if it says laptop, well, then we have the laptop page. And if we get something entirely different, which is not products or nothing or laptop, well, in that case, we just say that we didn't found the URL. Okay, so basically it's like an error. So we're gonna say was not found on the server. And this is a correct case of using the 404, right? So an error, like I showed you in the beginning. All right, and so let's now actually test this out. So we have products here in the URL, as you see. So reload, and yeah, this is the products page. If we say laptop, whoa, what happened here? So it has to be the capital N, okay. Let's try that again. And this is the laptop page. Awesome. And now the third case, which is nothing. And now we get the URL was not found on the server. So that's not what we want. This is found. And that's actually because here it's not nothing. It is just the slash. Okay. So yeah, now this is the products page. With the products again, we get the product page. With the laptop, we get the laptop page. And if we have something else, then we get URL was not found on the server, and we have the 404 status down here. Okay. Now finally about this this ID parameter that we have here. So basically this ID here is a parameter in the URL. We're also now not responding to that. Okay. So we still get the laptop page, but nothing really happens according to this number. And so let's fix that. And the first step to do that is to actually retrieve this ID from this URL. And so that is where the URL module actually gets really handy. Okay, so let me show that to you. So we got the path name already. And now the query. So that part with the ID equals 1, 2, 3, etc., that is called the query. And so all we have to do is to now use the query. All right, let's now, just to make sure that it makes sense to you, let's again log it to the console here so that you see what we're actually talking about. So let's reload this. And so now you see here that we have query, and then in there we get an object saying ID is 4. So it basically parses, which is exactly the name of the function. So it parses our URL and the query string that we have, and it creates this object saying ID 4. And we can now continue this. So with this format, so and I could say name equals Apple, let's say, and let's also say date equals today. Okay, so just for fun, so that you see what happens here. And so now we have an object with 3 elements. So ID, name, and date, all nicely parsed into an object that we can use. Okay, now in this case, we will only actually use the ID. Okay, and so it's gonna look like this. So in the query object, there will be this object with the ID key. And so actually, instead of having this query, we can simply add .id here, and then that will immediately give us the ID that comes from the query string. Okay, makes sense? So that is how we read the ID from our URL. And so with that, we can actually respond to this. So this is the laptop page for laptop, and now the number. So let's do a template string here. So replace this here. ID. And so this should now give us the exact number that we have in the URL, right? So ID 4, and let's wait for it. For laptop 4, great. For 3, 2, and so on and so forth. So awesome. Now in this data JSON, we start with 0, and then we have 4 laptops. So what would happen if we type in the 5 or the 10 or something else? Well, of course, everything works the same. So here we get exactly the number that we type in here. But in the case of this store here, it doesn't make much sense because the last one that we have is with the 4, but with the 5, there is not really a laptop. Okay? And so the response that we want in this case is something like this. Okay? Again, because number 5 is not actually the ID of one of our products. Okay? And so how are we going to do that? Well, very simple. We actually just do it here in this routing path. Okay? So we say that the path name has to be laptop, and at the same time, the ID must be smaller than laptop data.length. .length, okay? And that is because laptop data is an array, okay? So this data here, it's basically an array of these 5 objects. And so if we have 5 objects in here, then the length of the array will be 5. Okay? And so by having this test, we'll then ensure that this ID here is always smaller than 5. And so right now, if we have 10, well, then we get URL was not found on the server. With 5, we also get the same error, but then with 4, which remember is the last laptop, we get the page for laptop number 4. So, awesome. So that is our routing. And that should be actually enough for just one video. And so this is actually very simple, a very simple routing situation. In a real world app, it will get very big with tens, hundreds of routes. And so this code can be quite difficult and it can be quite complicated to do this. And so usually when working with Node, almost everyone, I would say, uses a Node framework called Express to handle routing and to handle lots of other stuff. All right? But I think it's very important to actually understand the basics of the technology, in this case Node.js, before using a framework like Express. All right? And so that's exactly what you're doing here. You're learning the very basics of how we can do this basic stuff with Node.js. It's very exciting to be able to really run JavaScript on the server. So let's wrap up this video here. In the next one, we will then implement basically the visual part and getting all the data from the JSON data that we already imported. Okay, so see you back here in a second. Welcome back. So let's now take care of our application data and the user interface as well by using a technique called templating. So basically we have this HTML template that will then be filled with the data for each of the laptops. So for example, when it's laptop 4, then our template will get filled with all this data, this image, this price, then this data, and also the description. But if we have image 3, for example, then it is a different price, a different image, different data, different name here, and everything changes, but the template is the same, okay? And so what we're going to do now is to take an HTML file that I coded for this page and convert it into a template, which we can then use to replace the data and send that back to the browser. Okay? Maybe it sounds complicated, but it's actually quite straightforward. Okay? So let's open up the laptop.html. And so this is the HTML code that I was talking about. I also have the CSS code right in the HTML because that's easier. Okay? And so down here, that is the HTML that we will now replace with some placeholders basically that we can then replace. Okay, so let's create a folder here called templates. And then copy these two into that folder so that we keep the originals here. What happened here? Copy. Yeah, sure, I wanted to paste. So paste them in there, and here we go. Close all of this. Let's rename this also. And the name doesn't really matter. I'm just gonna call it template and then the original name. All right, so starting with template overview, or actually template laptop. Let's come down here, and everything that is data, we will now replace with a placeholder. So here we have the price. So let's replace that. And what I'm gonna do here as a placeholder is like using a couple of symbols so that we don't accidentally replace something that we actually want to keep. So if we do like this, well, then we can be sure that nowhere else on the page, I actually want this, okay? So now we know that nowhere else on the page will probably be something like this, right? So this is our placeholder. If we just call this price, just like this, maybe there might be some other string exactly like this, and then we would replace something that we actually want to keep. And so with this kind of unique looking text here, that is not going to happen. And so we're always going to use this format here. Okay, then here we want the image. We actually copied this one here, that's easier. Here the slash, and I'm going to explain why here in a second, or actually a bit later in the video, because the image will be something that we will have to fix later. Okay, as the alt text here, we want the product name. Okay, and the product name will be this here. Right? So again, later we are going to replace all of this by the data that's going to come from this JSON. So the price, the product name, then image, CPU, RAM, storage, screen, and description. Okay? So the product name here, again, the product name. Then here we have the screen. Then we have the CPU. We have storage, and finally we have RAM. Then this here is the description. And then finally, again, the price. Okay. Then here I have some emojis, as you're probably noticing, and maybe on your computer they are not working, maybe you don't have the latest operating system version, and you can just use something else, so you can get rid of the emojis altogether if you don't like them, okay? But anyway, our template here should now be done, and we are now ready to basically load this HTML file, replace all of these placeholders by the real text, and then send that HTML to the browser each time that we request a certain laptop. Okay, makes sense? So let's do that. And it's right here in the laptop route, right? So fs read file again. And this time we're not going to use the sync version. Okay, so many times in Node there are synchronous and asynchronous versions of the same functions. Now I'm not going to go into real deep details here, but the synchronous version is always blocking. So basically it makes the entire code stop for the time that the function is doing its work, and that is going to block the entire thread for all the users that are accessing your code. Because Node.js runs in something called a single thread, and so there's only one thread in the computer that runs your application, no matter if you have 10 users or a million users. That sounds a bit at the same time, okay? So if you block the single thread with a synchronous function that takes up a lot of time, all the other users will have to wait until that function finishes its work. And so usually we always try to use the asynchronous versions, okay? Because then they do the work in the background, and as soon as they're finished, they simply run the callback that we pass into the asynchronous function, okay? And so that's what we're going to do here. So we have the asynchronous file read, and then we need to pass in the file name of the template that we just created. Again, we have to use the dir name variable, and then templates, and template laptop.html. Then the character encoding again, so UTF-8. And now this time, again, we have the callback function in here. And that callback function gets access to at least two parameters, which are error and the red data. Okay, so this time we're not going to save anything to any variable like we did up here in this synchronous file read, but instead we're going to wait until Node finishes reading our file and then calls our callback and passes the data into that callback as the data parameter. So now in here, in this callback, we will have access to that data using this data parameter. Okay? Now up here, we did the synchronous file read here, and I just want to mention this because you might be wondering why the hell we used the synchronous version up here. And we did so because here it is no problem, because this only happens once you start your app, and not while maybe millions or at least thousands of users might be using your app at the same time, okay? Because remember, each time that someone accesses your code, this is the callback function that is executed, okay? And so this is where you don't want to block the main thread. But here is no problem, because again, it runs only once when you start up your application. Anyway, what we have here now is basically this HTML read into this data variable, right? So all of this here is now as a string in that data variable. So now all we have to do is to replace again these placeholders, as I mentioned before. Okay, and so that's very easy. So let's do that. So let's create a variable here called output, and it's actually a let because we're going to change this basically for each of the placeholders. Okay, so this will be data.replace. It's a very simple string method. And so we say, and let's start here by the product name. And then replace it with the actual data. And what is the actual data? Well, it is the laptop data, right? So that is our array here that we read from the data.json file, and then at the position of the ID. So ID, which is, remember, the ID that we read from our URL. Okay, and so if we read the number 3, well, then we're going to access the laptop data at position number 3. Okay, so we have that laptop now. Imagine that it's number 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and what we want is the product name. Okay, dot product name. And let's actually create this variable here outside. So just like this, so take it from here, and so we only have to read it once. And so it's now laptop.productName. Okay, and now all we have to do is to do the same for all the others. Now keep in mind that this replace method here will actually return a new string. All right, so output is now data with the product name replaced. What this means is that when we next want to replace the next placeholder, let's say image, we have to do that in the output from before. Okay? Otherwise, we're going to do it in the original data variable where the product name was not yet changed. Okay, so basically this is like a chain. So first we replace the product name, then in that variable we replace the image, and then the price, the screen, and so on and so forth. Okay? And now we can just duplicate this here a couple of times. So we have image, then we have price, then we have the screen, we have CPU, we have storage, we have the RAM, and then finally we're going to have the description. And I guess that's all for now. All right, now there's just one small issue here, which is that replace only replaces the first occurrence of each of the labels, so of the strings that we're searching for. Now we have this price here, I remember, twice. And so we have to change that. And the way we do it is to actually use something called a regular expression. Okay? And I'm not going to go deep into that here again. You can just always Google a regular expression when you need it. Okay? Now all I'm going to do here is to actually replace these quotes here with a slash. Okay? Because a regular expression always starts and ends with a dash. And then the same here. So all of these here need to go now. and then slash int g. Okay, so again, regular expressions is something that you can just Google. This is not a part of Node.js. It is just a regular JavaScript. All right, and if this here seems a lot of work to you, then of course, as I mentioned before, there are tools in Node.js, and mainly I'm talking about something called Express, which is a framework for Node, which takes some of the pain away from this. So we can use something called template engines, which will make it a lot easier to do this, what we're now doing manually. But again, I think it's a great exercise to learn how things actually work and how you can do everything on your own also, even without using any framework, all right? So we should now have our final HTML in this output variable, and then all we have to do is to actually send this to the browser. So send the response back. So we use the res variable again, so the res object, and then end and output. All right, let's check that out. We have number 4, and we have some kind of error here. So let's check out what's happening. And it says here that output has already been declared. And of course, yeah, this doesn't make any sense. Let's just get rid of all of them. So we only need to declare it, of course, once, and then we're good to go. Try that again, and bam, here we go. So we have our real HTML page here with all the data that is coming from the Samsung Notebook 9. So from number 4. So we have the RAM storage screen, and you will see everything is the same as we have in our data JSON. So that's amazing. That's really great. Number 1 is the Apple MacBook, and now we have 1 terabyte, a 15-inch Retina display, and a 6-core Intel i9. And of course, this huge price. Now, one thing that's missing here is the image, and we're going to fix that a bit later, because that's something a bit particular. And for now, I just want to continue with this templating now for the other part, so for the product. So we have the laptop page now working. Let's go ahead and do the same for the product overview. So basically, this part here. Okay, now this will be a bit more difficult because we will basically have a loop which will loop over all of our products, and then for each of them create this HTML for this card here. So if we have only one product, it will only create, of course, one of these product cards. If we have 10, then we want 10 of these product cards. And so we have to do that with a kind of loop. So let's again start by creating the template. Okay, so we have the template overview. And so let's go ahead and do the same as we did before down here in the HTML. All right. And actually, I think I forgot something here, because the product name should also be in the title. So right here as well. Okay, so now if we change, then it also says Dell XPS 13 in the title and also down here. Okay, so that part we didn't have before. Anyway, going back to the template overview, we will now actually have to split it in two. And that's because of what I explained to you a moment ago, which is that we have to create these cards here. All right, so only this part, we have to create this one here in a loop. And we have to create as many as we need according to the number of laptops in our data. And so we need one template for everything that's outside, so that's not the card, so that we have basically that container where we can then put the cards into. Okay, does that make sense? So we'll actually go ahead and cut this here, create a new template, template card.html, and then paste it here. And what we want here in this place is all the cards. So we will create a string basically with all of the HTML for all the cards, and then replace this string with that code which contains the cards. Okay, and so in here we're actually done. So all we have to replace really is this part. Right up here there's nothing really, and then all the data is actually here. So again, we have the image. Let me go ahead and copy this pattern here. Then in the alt, we will have the product name again. Then here the same. here it's the screen. The CPU, and finally the price. So this one here has a bit less data. Now actually we also need something else, and that is the href for this link. So we want to go to laptop and then remember our query string. So ID equals and then the ID, right? So let me show that to you in the original. So in here, as you can see down there in the corner, right, we will have laptop and then the query ID of ID equals 0, because that will then lead us to the page, as you see then the ID 0, which will then load the data according to the ID, such as we did in the previous step. Okay, and so now in the overview, we will actually have to construct this ID so that it will then take us to the correct laptop that we want to display. Okay, makes sense? So again, the path is laptop and then the ID equals the ID that we're then going to replace. All right, and so that's actually it already, I believe. And so let's go back and do that here in the route for the product, so the product overview. So don't need that. And now we could go ahead and copy a bunch of this code here, but then we would have duplicate code, and that's not ideal. So instead, let's simply create a function for that, which we can then reuse. So that's always the better thing to do, not only in JavaScript, but in programming in general. Right, so let's create function replace template. And so what we need in here is the original HTML, and we need, of course, the laptop. Okay, and so now what I'm going to do is to cut all of this and paste it down here. Okay, just format this selection, and all right, just one minor change that we have to do here, because this is no longer called data now, it is the original HTML, which is coming from this parameter, right? Then in the end, all we have to do is to return the output. Okay, and finally, we also need to replace the ID. Okay, so that's for this part here. This part we didn't yet have here in the code, and so I'm adding that to the replace template function now. So let's use replace template first here in this place, which we already had working. So const output will be replace template, and here we passed in the data and the laptop. All right, and just to see if this actually works, let's just reload this, and indeed it does. So everything works the same, and so we simply exported this functionality into its own function so that we can now do the same with the product overview. Okay, so where do we have that part? Yeah, it's right here. Let's actually add some comments here to make this a bit more legible. So product overview or products. Then the laptop detail, and then URL not found. All right, so that always makes it a little bit easier to understand. So again, we need to do this in two phases, basically, as I explained before. So we first need to basically load all the HTML, which is not in the cart. So basically just everything here around. So the title basically, and then this background. Okay, and so that is just this HTML that we have down here. So just this, and we will then go ahead and replace the cart with the HTML generated using this template. Okay, so again, we need to do this in two steps because we want to have a dynamic number of laptops. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab this code here because it's quite similar and there's no need to rewrite all of it. So it's template overview now. And now this part is what we don't need. And now just to check, let's actually simply render what we already have. Okay, and so instead of render output, it's now render the data. So this parameter here. Okay, so let's try that out. So products is our route, and here we go. So we have the title, and then we have this string here that we now in the next step need to replace with our cards. So I can actually go ahead and copy this again and then have it in here. Okay, and so this callback function here basically, so this new one here needs to be inside the first one because we only want to read the card template as soon as the overview template has been read. Okay, so basically to create a sequence here. All right, so this is now template cards or card. This is no longer needed because we're not going to send the data just here without the cards in there. And so let's now loop through all of our different laptops and create the template for each of them. All right, and that should be fairly easy as well. So laptop data, remember that is the array where all of our laptops are stored, so all the objects for each of the laptops. And so we do a simple map. And remember that map is an array method which loops through the array, and in each iteration it saves the result of the callback function into a new array. Okay, and so we need to actually save this here to a new variable. Output, all right. So we've been calling this always output, and so this one is the cards output, all right? So we want to loop through the laptop data, and for each element, what we're going to do is to use our function. So our replace template function that we used before, and so now it's really handy that we did this function, all right? Because all we need to do now is to pass in the cards HTML, so data, and then the laptop, which in this case is the current element called AL, right? So remember, we need to pass in the original HTML and the laptop. And in this case, the original HTML is this data that we read for the card, and the element is the current element of this iteration through the laptop data array. All right, so let's just log this to the console here, just so that it makes 100% sense to you. I'm not sure it does at this point. And so let's just reload. This looks a bit weird, but don't worry. Right now, I'm only interested in the output here. And so you see that we have now the HTML for all these cards. So it's an array actually, so an array of all these strings. So we have the card, then here we have the next element, so the next element in the array, a new card, and so we will have 5 cards for all the 5 laptops. Okay, makes sense? Now we want this actually in a string, and so all we have to do is to say join, and again we did this before, so this is nothing new really. So we join this with an empty string, and if I reload this now, you will see that the output is simply a huge string with all of this HTML. So perfect. So what is the next step that we need to do? Well, all we have to do now is to replace that cards placeholder, so this one here, with this HTML that we just generated. Okay, so this data here. And so let's actually give it a name here. Let output equal the data. All right. And so now all we have to do is to change that output so that original data here, so the overview output, and let's actually call it overview output to make it a little bit less confusing, I guess. So the overview output will be overview output dot replace, and so the string is this one, and now we don't have to worry about any regular expressions because there's only going to be one of this. So we want to replace this placeholder by the cards, or with the cards output. And now all we need to do is to render that overview output. And that should be it. Okay, let's try it out. And bam, here we go. Amazing, right? All that's really missing is the image again, but again, I'm going to fix that in a minute. But for now, just see how it actually dynamically on the fly generated this page based on our data. And if I go ahead and remove one of them, of course, let's say I remove this Dell product here. Just get rid of it. If I now reload, then it's of course gone, and now we only have these 4 left. So really, it does it automatically, dynamically, and on the fly. So that is the power of Node.js and JavaScript on the server. As you see, you can really recycle 90% of what you already know of JavaScript and take it to the server to build these back-end applications without any problem. So now it's back, and it's back here as well. Okay, and with everything now working, the last thing that we have to fix is these images not working. So let's actually take a look at them, inspect them, and try to figure out what is not working here. So for all of this, we have this error message. The server responded with a status of 404 not found. So why does this actually happen? Well, it does happen because Node.js doesn't serve any files by default. Every URL is always like a route. And so, for example, if we have this image here, for Node.js, this is just a simple request. Okay, so let's try to figure out what happens if we were to simply put it in here, like this, then we will get the URL was not found on the server. All right, maybe you're thinking that's because it is in the image folder in data. All right, so let's try that out. Because you might think that this part here is like the home folder, and then we need to simply type data/image, and that's it. But that is not how it works actually. All right, because on the Node.js server, this concept of folders and files does not really exist. So everything is like a request. And if we request this image here, well, then we need to kind of respond to that request as well. But right now we only request to the products route and to the laptop route, right? And so we now need basically a route for images as well, so that we can then serve these images on these requests. Okay, and to illustrate this even more, let's go ahead and log this path name here. Okay, and so now you will see that there is not just one request, right? So there's not just a request for these products, but also for style.css and for these 5 images. Okay, so we loaded that page, but that is not the only request. All of the resources that are on the page are also requests, and we need to respond to them if we want to display something based on them, right? So in this case, these images. We also have this style here, but let me just get rid of that. It's probably here in one of these templates. Yeah, right here. That is actually the reason why I did the style inline. So I put it, all the styles right in the HTML files so that we don't have to deal with CSS as well, because then we would have to need yet another route, and that's not really practical. All right. So again, with these frameworks like Express.js, this is a lot easier. You don't have to really do this manually. But once again, I like to really understand how and why things work the way they do. And I think it's also very beneficial for you as well. Okay, so let's now try to do a route for images in general. Of course, we're not going to do a route for each of them individually, right? We're going to have a general route that works for all of the images. So what we want here is another route. So images, else if. And now what we need here is basically a true false value indicating if the resource that we're requesting is an image. Okay, and again, if you need something like this, you can always Google like regular expression to find image extension. Okay, so basically that's what I did for this, because it's really difficult and time intensive to really learn how regular expression works. All right, I find it easier to just Google it. Okay, so we always start the regular expression with slash and end it with slash, and then in there, there's some kind of magic happening. And in this case, it works just like this. So basically, we test if there is an extension, which is the dot. So if there is a dot JPEG, or maybe a JPEG written with E, because sometimes you see that, or a PNG, because we actually have a PNG, this one here. And let's say we might have a GIF or a GIF, I don't know. And so let's add that here as well. Then we need this $sign here for some reason /I. All right. And so this is our regular expression. And we will now test if our path name contains basically this regular expression. So we say .test, which is a method that is available on all regular expressions in JavaScript.